Hello and welcome back to Sociology 101. Today we're going to talk about the issue of unconditional election as the Romans chapter 9 Jacob versus Esau dichotomy set up by Calvinists often entails. So let me explain what I'm talking about. In order for Calvinists to present this concept of unconditional election, God unilaterally picks certain people for salvation without any regard to not only their morality, but their faith in Christ. In other words, God doesn't foreknow or know of or take into consideration somebody's morality or their faith. He doesn't take into account their nationality, of course. We all believe that. But he also doesn't take into account the good and bad they end up doing, which for a Calvinist means even the faith that they end up having. He doesn't take any of that into account as to whether he chooses them before they're ever born to become believers so as to be saved. It is a unilateral choice of God. And the number one proof text for unconditional election is Romans chapter 9 with regard to the twins. Before they were born and done anything good or bad, which is reference to their morality, but again, Calvinists take that as also a reference to their faith or not. And he's taken it to reference to their individual salvation, either effectually being saved or being damned, versus the way we would take it, obviously, is about God choosing the nation of Israel over the other nations to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That verse 4 and 5 is talking about the covenants, the laws, the prophets, the Messiah, and his message came through the nation of Israel. That's the purpose of God electing. And Jacob, not Esau, is referencing God's choice of that child to be the lineage through which the Messiah would come, not the other child. And that's what we think he's talking about. And we go into that in other details in other places. But here's the problem with the Calvinist. If you've got God electing Jacob unto salvation without reference to the good or bad he does, then the consistent hermeneutic would be to say, therefore, he must be electing Esau without regard to his good or bad for reprobation, damnation. Esau I hated. So if you're going to use a Calvinistic hermeneutic with regard to Romans chapter 9 and Jacob and Esau, and you're going to say God unconditionally elects one twin to be saved without regard to his good or bad, then just an ad hoc claim, well, in order for him to condemn Esau, he actually takes the fall and Esau's sin into account, which is exactly what we've heard both RC Sproul, when we went over the exposition of RC Sproul of Romans 9, it's exactly what he says. He goes through this whole double predestination explanation, the superlapsarian versus the infralapsarian, and he says that the people who are condemned, the reprobates who are condemned on the basis of their sin, while on the other hand, the elect are not elected on the basis of their faith. And this is just an ad hoc claim of the Calvinist. And so I don't want to just put words in their mouth. I like to let Calvinists speak for themselves, as you've heard me do many, many times before. And so I want you to hear John Piper give this explanation. He gives a very clear explanation because somebody asked this exact question. Matter of fact, the title of the broadcast from Ask Pastor John is, Are Calvinists Inconsistent when it comes to Romans 9? Because of this very issue. And you can hear what John Piper says. Let's listen.
Now, what Henry is pointing out is that the scriptures, not just Calvinists, the scriptures teach that everyone who is sentenced to eternal condemnation, hell, deserves to be there. That's biblical teaching. Nobody is in hell because they don't deserve to be there. They will be there because of their unbelief and their sin.
Okay, so they will be in hell because of something. So it's not a unilateral condition without regard to the good and bad they do. It is with regard to the bad they do. And notice that's just an ad hoc claim. In other words, there's no basis for this claim given the Calvinistic interpretation of unconditional election with regard to one twin. And that's what I am calling out here. This is what Calvinists would have to refer to as the Foresight sin view. In other words, in the same way that they caricature the Arminian by saying that God must exist on some kind of a timeline, peering into the future to foresee the faith of the Christians in the future. He foresees their faith, or as Matt Chandler liked to put it, God gets into a DeLorean, a time travel machine, and travels into the future to see in advance who is going to believe, and then elects them based upon his foreseeing of their faith. Well, they mock that and laugh at that and caricature that But yet then on the other hand, at least these two Calvinists, RC Sproul and John Piper, just ad hoc claim, well, the reason Esau and reprobates are condemned is because God takes into account their sin. In other words, he foresees. He looks through the quarters of time. We could even caricature their view as God peering into the future to foresee the sin of Esau, and therefore reprobates Esau on the basis of what he foresees Esau will do. Let Piper continue to answer this and see kind of how the ad hoc claim, in other words, ad hoc is just claiming something without precedent. There's no real argument or reason behind it. He just says this is the way it is, but he doesn't give an explanation as to how you can consistently use Romans 9 in that way to claim that one twin is being chosen for salvation without regard to anything good or bad he does, but the other twin is chosen for reprobation based upon the bad he does, even though the scripture says it's before they did anything good or bad. In other words, they're not giving a good explanation as to how you can take one and not the other. And I pointed this out in a more recent video, and I had a Calvinist friend actually contact me, and he says, I hadn't thought of that before. That's a really good point. I'm not really sure how I would answer it, to be honest. It got him thinking, in other words, as to how a Calvinist can consistently apply a hermeneutic of unconditional election with regard to Jacob, but not unconditional election with regard to the reprobation of the other twin, since obviously the passage is not taking into account the good or bad they end up doing.
Henry is saying this sounds contradictory. Unconditional election on the one hand, conditional damnation on the other hand.
So notice he is pointing out the issue. You got unconditional election to salvation with Jacob, and you've got conditional election to reprobation for Esau. And that seems contradictory given the fact that Paul, when quoting this, says before they'd done anything good or bad, Jacob I have loved, Esau I hated. If you take that from a Calvinistic reading, then it seems to be very inconsistent for the Calvinists to take one of them as unconditional election to salvation and the other as not. And so that is the issue, and Piper is rightly laying out the problem as it's being asked of him. Now let's see if the answer is not just as I've accused it of being just an ad hoc claim. This is just what it is, and you just got to accept my word for it.
When God decided not to choose a person, he did not base his decision on foreseen unbelief and sin. But when God condemns a person, in the end, it is based on unbelief and sin. And Henry wonders if that's a contradiction. And my answer is no, it is not.
Okay, so no, it's not. Ad hoc claim, unless he now explains why it's not. In other words, if he gives a good rational explanation as to why the hermeneutic is not inconsistent, then we're going to have an answer. But does John Piper give a good rational argument as to why that is not inconsistent? Because for all practical purposes, that is about as inconsistent as I can imagine an hermeneutic being. But now let's see if he gives a good explanation as to why he's claiming, no, it's not inconsistent.
There are good reasons for why God elects in the beginning in the way he does, and there are good reasons for why God judges in the end the way he does. And these acts of election and condemnation and these reasons are not contradictory.
Okay, so notice the categorical jump that Piper just made there. God has good reasons, we don't know what they are, for his election of certain individuals before, and he has good reasons to condemn at the end. So notice he jumps over to the end instead of understanding that, remember, we're talking about Romans 9 here with regard to before they were born and done anything good or bad, remember? So it's both about the beginning, God's choice in the beginning. And notice that John Piper just automatically jumps to God's choices at the end of time to condemn those who are in sin. In other words, it's the Foresight sin view. It's God peering through the quarters of time to foresee the sin of the reprobates, thereby condemning them on the basis of their sin, because Calvinists, as you'll hear him argue, know it would be unjust of God to condemn an innocent man. And who is more innocent than an unborn baby? Somebody who has not yet done anything bad. And yet that's exactly the reading of Calvinism if the consistent hermeneutic is applied. And they can't have a consistent hermeneutic with regard to Jacob and Esau without condemning innocent people. And that's the problem of the Calvinistic system.
Condemns in the end on the basis of unbelief and sin because he's just. And the principle of justice in the Bible is Exodus 23:7, do not kill the innocent and righteous. And Proverbs 17:15, it's an abomination to the Lord to condemn the righteous. And Romans 2:8, those who do not obey the truth but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. That's the biblical principle of justice, and God is just.
Okay, so he's making a great biblical case for the fact that God's just and he would not condemn an innocent man. Yet, the consistent hermeneutic of Romans chapter 9 is that before the twin did anything bad, before Esau did anything bad, he was, salvifically speaking, hated by God. That would be a consistent hermeneutic. The ad hoc hermeneutic of the Calvinist is no, it's unconditional with regard to the election to salvation, but it is conditioned upon a foreseen sin of Esau and the reprobates. And we're going, okay, where are you getting this from? Does Paul explain this somewhere else? Are we pulling, where are you getting this? It's an ad hoc claim. I mean, it's just, no, we say it because it is. It's just true. That's just the way it must be. Because in order for us to maintain our Calvinism, we just have to have this way of thinking, because otherwise we would be condemning God for condemning innocent people. And we can't have that because of these other scriptures that clearly teach that God doesn't condemn innocent people. And so what do we do with that? We ad hoc claim unconditional election to salvation, but conditional election to damnation, and just goes right against the natural reading of the text from the Calvinistic vantage point.
God's final decision to assign someone to hell will be because they deserve it. There will be no injustice. No one will be in hell who does not deserve to be there. And
what is the basis of whether they deserve to be there or not? Because if God has ordained whatsoever comes to pass, i.e. has decreed whatsoever comes to pass, i.e. he is the one who ultimately controls the decisions you make to reject him in his gospel appeal, then why and on what basis can you say they deserve what they get? In other words, if a person is born in a condition where they cannot do other than reject the gospel, and God condemns them for rejecting the gospel, then on what basis are you saying that they deserve to be in hell? Do you explain that? No, you just ad hoc claim they do deserve it because the Bible says they deserve it, but Calvinism's still true, even though it doesn't look like they would deserve it if Calvinism is true. Again, just ad hoc claims.
No degree of punishment in hell will be out of proportion to the greatness of the guilt of the sinner, Luke 12:47. So God condemns on the basis of unbelief and sin because he's just, but he elects before the foundation of the world, not based on unbelief and sin, because he's free and independent of all external constraints in forming his own plan.
So because he's free and independent of all constraints, then he can unconditionally elect people to salvation. But apparently he can't unconditionally elect people to damnation, because that would be unjust. Do you see the problem here, guys? Do you see the blatant inconsistency of the Calvinistic hermeneutic with regard to how they're reading? Now, somebody said, well, how do you deal with this? And you're just coming at Calvinist. I've broadcast after broadcast of how we take what the purpose of God in election is. The purpose of God in election is not about individuals being chosen for effectual salvation. Unconditional election to salvation is not in view here, okay? What's in view here is God's unconditional election of the nation of Israel to fulfill his service, to fulfill his plan of bringing redemption to the world. Verse 4 and 5 tells us what God's purpose in electing Israel was all about. And that purpose in electing Israel has not failed, because God has always brought about his purpose, even when the people he chooses are unfaithful. And God is demonstrating how he has not failed to bring about his purpose and his plan, even though Israel is unfaithful. For the most part, he's bringing his purposes through the ragtag group of no-names, i.e. fishermen, who have refused to bow a knee to Baal, so to speak. They are believers, and God brings his purpose through the faithful, even when the group as a whole are unfaithful. And this is about faith versus works, not monergism versus synergism, Calvinism versus Arminianism. We go over that in other episodes. So I'm going to point to those episodes to go over our positive presentation and interpretation of Romans 9. What I'm confronting here is the ad hoc claim of the Calvinist to ultimately have a Foresight sin view with regard to condemnation, but apparently have an unconditional concept of a unilateral choice of God unto salvation, and how inconsistent that is with their hermeneutic.
Let me say it again. Here's the way Paul puts it. He seems to be laboring to make this clear. Though they were not yet born and had done nothing good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, good or bad, but because of Him, His purpose, His will, His counsel alone, His freedom. She was
But because of the purpose of Him who calls. And who is He calling? Both Jew and Gentile. And so those who respond either in faith to that call or by resisting the call, ultimately one is saved based upon whether they believe, which is exactly what Paul concludes in the final verses 30 and following, when he says, the Jews who have pursued these things through works are not attaining righteousness, but the Gentiles who are pursuing them through faith are attaining it. So it's a faith versus works concept. And so both have been called. He calls first the Jew and then the Gentile. The gospel comes to the first of the Jew and then to the Gentile. He's called both. But who are the ones who are receiving righteousness? Those who come in faith, right? So that's the whole dichotomy in Paul's mind. In the Calvinist mind, it's about whether God unilaterally picked you before you were ever born, arbitrarily, I would call it, unconditional choice of God as to whether make you into a believer or not. And that's not at all what Paul is even talking about, which is why you have this dilemma created by the Calvinistic worldview.
told the elder will serve the younger. So here's...
Now, notice the elder will serve the younger, not I will save the younger and damn the elder, okay? So it's an election to service. I have chosen this nation to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That's the original promise. Read Genesis 3. The original promise is to Abraham, not I have chosen to save you and your descendants to the neglect of all the other people. It's not what the promise is. The promise is what? Through your seed, I will bless all the families of the earth. What does that mean? Through your seed, the Messiah will come. The prophets will come. The law will come. The covenants will come. You will be the mouthpiece for God, your nation, your people. That's not going to come through Esau. It's not going to come through Ishmael. It's going to come through Isaac, and it's going to come through Jacob, because I have made this choice. And it's not I'm not choosing them based upon the morality of those children. I am choosing to carry my promise and my purpose even through people who are unfaithful, even through people who try to stone the messengers, even through people who, yes, kill my own Messiah. I'm going to accomplish my purpose through them. This is proving God's purpose does not fail just because the nation of Israel, the chosen people, stand against His purpose and His promise. Because even in their standing against His purpose and His promise, He can harden them when He chooses to harden them so as to bring about His purpose and His plan through them. That's the point here. But when you put on the Calvinist lenses, you've got this whole dichotomy that you have to deal with God unilaterally picking people for salvation or damnation.
That's why I think Henry says this sounds contradictory, that God condemns on the basis of unbelief and sin, but He elects before the foundation of the world, not based on unbelief and sin. And I think Henry says that sounds contradictory because we don't know how God sees to it that all those who are not elect do in fact become guilty of condemnation. Let me say that again. We don't know how God renders it certain or sees to it that all those who are not elect do in fact become guilty of condemnation. How does real guilt become a certainty for all the non-elect? Which is another way of asking, how does a sovereign God govern the heart choices of all human beings, and yet those human beings be accountable for their heart choices? And I am happy to let that be one of the hidden things that belongs to the Lord. Deuteronomy 29:29. What we do know is this: both are taught in the Bible. God governs the choices of all people, and all people are accountable for their choices.
Okay, so here it is. God determines what your choices you're going to make, but you're still held accountable for your choices. And we don't know how God's good. We don't know how men are really guilty, and we don't really know how God's good. He's not to be blamed for this, and we really don't know why men are really guilty. But that's just the Bible. What does he need to drop? If he just drops determinism, that God somehow unilaterally controls the decisions of man, if he just drops that, then he doesn't have this dilemma. In other words, this dilemma is being created by the Calvinists by insisting what? Exactly what the quote says at the bottom. We don't know how God renders it certain or sees to it that the reprobate remain guilty and are certainly guilty. We don't know how he does that. We just know what he does. Based upon what? A misreading of Romans 9, maybe? maybe if you just drop your determinism, you don't have to do this. Does this quote from Piper not remind you of the quote we read all the time from John Calvin himself? Remember the one that we put up so oftentimes that I probably should have it memorized by now. I'll pull it up on the side chat again, or here on the bottom of the screen. How it was ordained by the foreknowledge and the decree of God, what man's future was, without God being implicated as an associate in the fault, as the author and the prover of transgression, is clearly a secret, so much excelling the insight of the human mind that I'm not ashamed to confess ignorance. I daily so meditate on these mysteries of his judgments that curiosity to know anything more does not attract me. Does that sound exactly like what you just heard John Piper say? I'm happy to confess ignorance as to how God's good and men are guilty. But we just know it's true that God determines what men will do, and that men are still held guilty for what God determined for them to do. And God's not guilty somehow. And we just say, we don't know. We don't know how that is. What's interesting to me is that he says he doesn't know how God renders it certain that Esau, for example, the reprobate, will be guilty. He just believes that he does. Why are you confessing ignorance on that? I'm not sure why you don't just say, well, because God decreed for his nature to be such from birth that he would always reject the things of God until he decrees for him to be reborn and therefore to accept the things of God. And so you don't have to appeal to mystery as to how he does it. He punishes all people by decreeing that they're in a condition from birth to be haters and rejectors of the things of God until they're rebirthed. And if he doesn't rebirth them, then they will continue to hate and reject the things of God. That explains how Esau ensured his guilt. How does God ensure or sees to it that Esau is guilty? Well, by decreeing that the fall will cause all people to be born in a condition where they're guilty of Adam's sin and cannot repent of that sin. That's how you do it. Why Calvinist, John Piper, why are you saying, I don't know how God does it, when your systematic tells us how God does it? TULIP tells us how God does it. T, total depravity. By God's decree, because of the fall of Adam, everybody's born guilty of what Adam did and incapable of confessing that fact in faith and trusting in their Messiah. That's what your claim of the system is. And unless they're irresistibly graced, the I, because of their unconditional election, the you, unless they're unconditionally elected and irresistibly graced, they cannot do otherwise, and they will not do otherwise. That's how. So why John Calvin and why John Piper are saying, well, we just don't know how God renders it certain that the Esau's of the world, the reprobates of the world are guilty, when your systematic of TULIP explains exactly how God renders it certain that they're guilty, is baffling to me. And so I just say, brethren, could it be that maybe you've misunderstood Romans 9? Could it be that maybe you've misunderstood what Romans 9 is talking about when he says that God's purpose in electing Israel has not failed? Just because it looks like the mass of Israel is standing against the purposes of God and against the Messiah, that God has not failed because God is actually using them in their rebellion. In fact, he's hardening them, blinding them in their rebellion to ensure the crucifixion and the ingrafting of the Gentiles, because he wants salvation to come to all people. And that through the salvation of the Gentiles, that the Jews themselves may be provoked to envy, and that they too might be grafted back in, as Romans chapter 11 actually states. And therefore, those who stumbled have not stumbled beyond recovery, as chapter 11, verse 11 says. That those hardened in chapter 9 are not the reprobates of the Calvinistic system that never had a hope of salvation, who are cut off unilaterally before they were born. No, they are people who have grown hardened and calloused in their rebellion, and therefore have judicially been cut off by God as an act of a judge, causing them to remain in their rebellion, blinding them from the truth, in part temporarily, so as to bring in the ingrafting of the Gentiles and the crucifixion of Christ for the redemption of the world. Does that make more sense than this unilateral choice of God to damn some people to hell before they did anything bad? And this whole quandary of how you have to deal with this ad hoc claim of unconditional salvation, but conditional damnation, even though the twins had not done anything good or bad when that choice is apparently made? Could you maybe just step back from your system just long enough to even consider that there might be a better interpretation than the one the Calvinists bring to Romans 9, which is basically the only real proof text they have for unconditional election. It's basically their major proof text for unconditional election and is the heart of the Calvinistic worldview. And yet look at how contradictory it is just by looking at some of the major scholars' claims with regard to how it works. And again, I'm saying these things with passion because I want my Calvinist brothers and sisters to see how inconsistent their own hermeneutic is with regard to Romans 9 and its application, and to understand there's much better ways to understand these texts than the way the Calvinists have taught us to understand these texts. And so, brothers, let's do better. Let's be good Bereans. Let's go to the scriptures. Let's look at the best of the best commentaries from both perspectives and actually say to ourselves, maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe I need to reconsider. God bless. Go now, share Christ, and show love.